Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. In fact, um, this crusade, the Fourth Crusade, is actually the reason I'm an historian now. One day read a paragraph about the Fourth Crusade, and I thought, how could that possibly happen? And so the Pope excommunicates the whole crusade at this point.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
so it's not off to a good start. Frequently you'll hear people say, you know, people from different cultures and everything, we all need to get together, we learn about each other, and then we'll all get along better. Historically speaking, that doesn't really seem to happen very often. The more they got to know each other, they were so different,
Oh,
um,
wow.
that the more they hated each other.
Wow.
But in reality, though, this event would be something that the Greeks would not forget, and to this day haven't forgotten it. Um, you ask your average Western European about the Fourth Crusade, they will know what you're talking about. You ask your average Greek about it, they know.
Welcome to Scholars Unravel the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. I was born in the Middle East, but grew up in America, where I practiced patent law and later founded a startup based on my own inventions. And then I went on to my ultimate passion, history, its lessons, shocking surprises, wow moments, and its myths and mysteries. To deep dive into history, I go to the source. I interview scholars, 150 and counting, passionate and preeminent scholars who have spent decades researching primary sources and writing about history. And my goal for this program is to correct our misperceptions and misconceptions about the Middle East, this fascinating region with its long and remarkable history. My guest is Dr. Thomas Madden. He's a professor of medieval history. He's the author of many books, including the following. First, The Concise History of the Crusades. Second, The Fourth Crusade, The Conquest of Constantinople. Third, The Fourth Crusade, Event, Aftermath, and Perceptions. And fourth, Enrico Dandolo and the Rise of Venice. This is part 2 of my 2-part conversation with Dr. Madden. In this interview, we discussed the following. Why did the Pope excommunicate the Fourth Crusade? Why did French Crusaders form a partnership with Venetian merchants? Why did Crusaders attack Zara, a Christian city? And why did the Crusaders sack Constantinople, the most important Christian city at the time? How did Crusaders break through the impenetrable walls of Constantinople? Where did the most important Christian relics come from? And why did the people of Greece snub Pope John Paul II when he visited Athens? So, stay with me as Dr. Madden and I unravel the Middle East. Dr. Madden, in the prior segment, we talked about the history of the Crusades, but I want to sort of focus on one particular crusade. In the opening years of the 13th century, Constantinople was sieged and plundered by Christians. What's what's the history behind this?
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. In fact, um, this crusade, the Fourth Crusade, is actually the reason I'm an historian now.
Oh,
I was an
wonderful.
undergraduate with no real idea about what I wanted to be an astrophysicist, but I wasn't very good at it. So I one day read a paragraph about the Fourth Crusade, and I thought, how could that possibly happen?
I know, right? Yeah.
And I spent the rest of my life trying to figure that out.
By the way, for our audience, you've written, I know what I know, 2 books on this subject. One is titled The Fourth Crusade, The Conquest of Constantinople. The other one is titled The Fourth Crusade, Event, Aftermath, and Perceptions. So, what's the history behind this? What happened?
Yeah, and I've also written another book called Enrico Dandolo and the Rise of Venice, which is really about the Fourth Crusade also.
Yes.
So, but yeah, so essentially, clearly that wasn't the plan of the Crusade. The original plan of the Crusade, which was called by Pope Innocent III in 1199, was to take Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been lost
So
to the
1199, we're talking about 100 years after the First Crusade.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Jerusalem had been under Crusader control from 1099 until 1187. So in 1187, the Muslim leader Saladin wages war against the Crusaders and defeats them, and captures Jerusalem. In fact, he captures most of the Crusader states.
And that period was about 80 some years that Europeans had ruled over Jerusalem and its surrounding area.
Yeah, 89 years in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And then they'll hold on to, they won't really have Jerusalem after that, but they'll hold on to the Crusader states along the coast. So what's today Syria, Lebanon, Israel? They'll hold on to that still for another century until 1291.
Okay.
But so the loss of Jerusalem was, for Europeans, was just massive. Everyone thought about it all the time because it was a clear evidence of God's displeasure with his people. And so Innocent III, when he became Pope, the first act was to call a crusade to try to retake. Now, there had already been a big crusade to try to take it back. This is the famous Third Crusade with Richard the Lionheart and all of that.
Yeah.
But it had failed. So he's calling another major crusade. In this case, the Crusaders, it's basically a kind of a joint operation. Lots of French knights are taking the cross to go on crusade. But they want to sail to the Holy Land. They don't want to walk through to Constantinople, because by this time, a century later, there's really bad relations between the Byzantines and the Western Europeans. They don't get along at all. And so they don't want to walk. They want to take a boat to get to the Holy Land. Except French nobles don't have boats. So what they do is they go into a partnership with Venice. Venice has lots of boats. And so the Venetians and the French kind of do a joint operation, and they agree that they will spend a year getting ready. The Venetians' job is to build the fleet and to get all the food, to purchase all the food that they'll need, because they'll have to load that all onto the boats.
This sounds very organized.
It's very organized. In fact, we know so much about it because the treaties and the contracts, the Venetians were businessmen, and they kept very good records, and they made contracts. So the contracts were set up. The way that this would be paid for is that each crusader, when they arrived in Venice the following year, they would all pay the amount of money to the Venetians so that they could recoup all these funds. So they had to have a number. So the French said that they would end up with 33,500 men, 11,000 horse, and so the Venetians went about spending the next year at enormous expense building a massive fleet, about 450 major vessels.
Wow, that's a major armada. Okay.
Yeah, it's the biggest one since ancient Rome.
Wow.
And then tons and tons of provisions. Well, to make a long story short, when the Crusaders arrived, they only had about 11,000. So they only had about
wait. They said they're going to have 33,500, 11,000, so less than a third.
Less than a third. And they said, okay, well, here's your money. And the Venetians are like, well, wait a second, you still owe us a whole bunch more money. I mean, it's not our fault you didn't get enough people. We're out all this money. So basically they just sat there for all summer waiting for more people to show up, and no one showed up. So eventually what they did was they worked out a deal where the Venetians agreed to loan the money to the Crusaders, and that saying that they could pay them back if they got booty on the crusade. And then that way they could get the crusade going. But in return, they said that they would have to spend the winter at this place, Zara, that's on Dalmatia, that had rebelled against Venice. The problem is Zara was a Catholic city, and it was under papal protection. So the Pope sent word that they were forbidden to attack Zara, but it was the only way to keep the crusade going. So they attacked Zara and took it. It was a Catholic city. and they spent the winter there. The Pope at this point
Wait, I'm sorry.
excommunicated.
I don't follow. These are Crusaders.
Right,
Venice tells them, well, you have to spend the winter somewhere, so get out of
right,
Venice.
right. And so Venice
They
brings,
attack a Catholic city that's also Christian.
yeah, it's
I
Christian.
mean,
The
of course,
reason now the Venetians said, look, they're rebels. They rebelled against us, and it's a righteous deed to give it back to us, and you can spend the winter here. Except the Pope said, no, you can't attack them. They're Christians, and also they're currently under the King of Hungary, who has taken the cross, which means he's not really going on crusade, but his lands are under papal protection. So now there are some crusaders who just refuse to do it, but the majority of them go ahead because the alternative is to disband the crusade.
yeah.
And um, and so the Pope excommunicates the whole crusade at this point.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
so it's not off to a good start. And then at this point they spend the winter there, and by this time they've eaten up almost all of their provisions that they were going to use. They only have a few months left of provisions. And so their concern is that even if they sail immediately for the Holy Land, by the time they get there, they'll be starving. They won't have ships anymore because the lease on the vessels will be over with. And they'll basically be, you know, they'll be causing more of a problem than actually helping anyone. Um,
Before I commented that this sounds so organized, but I have to retract that comment. Now it's quickly falling apart,
It's
right?
falling apart, yeah. So at this juncture, it turns out the current emperor of Constantinople, the guy named Alexius the Third.
The one in the 1090s was also Alexius, right?
Yeah, he was
Uh,
Alexius the First. This is
okay.
Alexius the Third.
Okay.
Alexius the Third became emperor because several years before, he grabbed his brother, who was emperor, Isaac, and blinded him, and then
Oh,
put him under house arrest. And so now his brother had a son whose name was also Alexius. And this young man fled Constantinople, and he had been running around the West for a while, trying to get someone to help him to overthrow his evil uncle. So here's a crusade. It's a
I'm
fairly
sorry.
large.
Is this a novel or is this
Yeah, I know.
history? This
Yeah, I
is
know.
like, oh, we
So
can't make this up. Okay.
yeah. So here there's this big crusade that's sitting in Zara. And so he sends word and he says, look, if you guys just make a small detour to Constantinople, the people there hate my evil uncle. They love me. And if you bring me there, they'll overthrow him if they see a fleet. And then I'll be the emperor and I will pay you enormous amount of money. So you won't have any problem with money anymore. I will provide all the provisions that you need from my lands, and I'll even join your crusade with you afterwards. And I will make the Patriarch of Constantinople accept Roman supremacy because there was a division between the Roman
Yeah.
Catholic and Greek Orthodox. I'll make him so we'll end the schism too. Something in there for the Pope too. Um, so most of the
So
Crusaders
many
don't.
promises there.
Yeah, most of the Crusaders don't want to take the deal because they want to finish their vow. They want to go to the Holy Land and get this over with. But the leaders accept the deal, and so this crusade sails to Constantinople. And once they arrive, the current emperor Alexius III, the evil uncle, he tells them, "Look, if you guys want food or something, I'll give it to you, but you can't take Constantinople, and I'm not giving up." Constantinople was impregnable. I mean, it was a massive city with
Yeah.
massive fortifications. But they expected a coup would happen, and it never really did. So as a result, they attacked the city, and ultimately, because they attacked it, they caused enough of an inconvenience to the people of Constantinople that they essentially just overthrew Alexius, and they accepted the young man,
Oh,
who now became Alexius the Fourth.
okay.
So the Crusaders were successful in that regard. He paid them about half of what he promised, which allowed them to pay their debts to the Venetians. And then but then he realized that his hold on power was so tenuous that he really needed them to stay and kind of be his bodyguard for a while.
Oh
So,
no.
so he asked them to stay until the next spring in 1204, just to kind of help him to firm up his hold on power. Again, most of the Crusaders didn't want to do it, but the leaders agreed to do it. And so they ended up staying there during that time. Ultimately, during that time, Alexius eventually came to the conclusion that it was getting awfully hard to pay the rest of the money he owed. I mean, he had paid a lot, mainly by confiscating money from his enemies, but he had run out of enemies, and he would have to. He started doing other things that were really unpopular, like melting down gold and pulling gems and things from churches to pay the Crusaders. That made him really unpopular
I
among the people.
bet.
So he got to this point where he figured if the crusade left, his people would kill him as soon as they left. So he was in a bad situation. Finally, he tried to switch sides and tell them to just go away, that he had paid them enough. At which point the Crusaders became angry, and so they attacked the city.
But they're
Ultimately,
within the city now.
no,
They're
they got pushed out. I mean, they came in initially as kind of like tourists,
yeah.
but then he asked them to stay outside in the suburbs, in the Galata suburb. So they stayed out there. Ultimately, in 1204, they attacked the city twice in April. The first time was the defeat. It was the only time that Constantinople ever was attacked from its inner harbor, which is where the fortifications were the weakest. Um, and uh, and the Venetians were instrumental in this because these attacks were from their vessels. The soldiers would climb up to the top of the masts and they would walk across on these bridges and they would attack the people on the walls. So you can just imagine, like 100 ships all coming up to these walls with soldiers on them fighting from these flying bridges.
Wow.
It was quite something.
You said was the second time that they were attacked from their inner
Yeah,
harbor. What was the first time?
well, they did it twice, both in the same place. On April 9th,
Oh, I see.
1204, they attacked and they failed. And they tried it one more time on April 12th, and that was successful. It was successful in a very odd way, though. There was a small group of Crusaders who found a walled up gate, and they started picking at it, and they opened it up, and they opened up a tiny little opening, and there were far more soldiers there were far more Byzantine soldiers than there were Crusaders, but they were the worst soldiers. They were terrible. They were poorly trained. As long as they had a giant wall between them and the Crusaders, they were good. But in any case, they saw these soldiers, and this one Crusader, a guy named Al of Clary, he demanded to have the honor of being the first one to enter. His brother tried to stop him. He was like, "It's certain death. Don't go in there." But he got down on his hands and knees, and he's crawling through this little hole, and his brother's holding his feet, trying to stop him from going in there. But he kicks his brother away, and he goes in. And this guy was a big guy, and he stood up in front of all these soldiers, and he pulled his sword out, and he just started roaring and ran at them, and they all just scattered like
Oh,
sheep.
wow. That
Yeah, I
is,
mean, when I first read that, because one of the sources for it is his brother, and I
yeah,
thought, well, that's not true. He's just making up a story about his brother.
boasting. Yeah, making up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but then I read the exact same story from a Byzantine senator who watched it all, and he's talking about how horrible this was, that this happened. As he
Oh,
said,
wow.
the Byzantine army took to its normal flight as the efficacious medicine of salvation. And so they just
Efficacious medicine of salvation. Okay. um, so they enter the
so they enter
second.
Constantinople, and they they sack the city. Now, it is true that according to what was a universal law of war in the Middle Ages, both Muslim and Christian too, was that a city that refuses to surrender um, can be sacked, usually for 3 days. And so that's essentially what they do. They had sworn, however, before they attacked the city, they had sworn on the
Could you just
Bible.
provide that explanation or qualification so that we understand that this wasn't so unusual for that time? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, it was understood that if a city refuses to surrender and it falls by storm, that the attackers have a right to sack the city for 3 days.
Okay. All right.
That was widely understood. Um, Almost every sack that happens, if it's something, that's why you would normally negotiate
Yeah,
if you didn't think you could hold out, because that way you won't be sacked.
exactly.
In this case, um, the Crusaders had sworn before they attacked, because this is a Christian city. It's not only a
Exactly.
Christian city, it's the greatest Christian city in the world.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so they had sworn beforehand to not touch the churches, not touch the women, and to respect the city. But that all got thrown out as soon as they actually took the city. It was such a big city, and it was so wealthy, and um,
You
there's
say
just
so
never.
wealthy, despite what Alexius the Fourth had done with confiscating stuff from his enemies and melting down. I don't know.
Yeah,
Effigies.
honestly, that was a drop in the bucket compared to how much money was in there. They just had such extraordinary wealth in that city because it was safe. It
Yeah.
was considered the safest place in the world. And so that if you had something you didn't want stolen, that's where you put it.
Do we
Um,
have any accounts or I don't know numbers, stats from the carnage that occurred?
yeah, there's some very good. The best description of it is by this senator, Nikitas Koniates. He was there when it was all happening. He gives a very detailed account of a lot of the things that the Crusaders did when they took the city. The sacking of, say, for example, of Hagia Sophia, which was the great church there, the imperial church. He talks about how they just pulled all the gold down in the church. They stripped the altar of everything that it had.
Wow.
He says that they put a French prostitute on the throne of the patriarch who sang dirty songs while they all uh, looted the church. And we also have some sources too from the Crusaders perspective. In fact, one of the things that they really looted a lot of was relics. So there's this one abbot who's there, Martin of Pyre, who uh, he in his memoirs talks about how he's a pious man, he's a churchman, so he's not going to steal gold and silver and things like that. He's going to go and steal the relics. So he goes into these various churches and threatens the czar, and that he steals all of those and then brings them onto his ship to venerate. Vast amounts of relics. That, from a medieval perspective, that was as valuable or more valuable than the gold and the silver, was the holy relics. And those came by the thousands to Western Europe. Um, it's no exaggeration to say most of the relics that are in Western Europe today in churches came from Constantinople during the sack of 1204,
Really?
including the most famous ones, like the Shroud of Turin. I'm sure
Yeah,
came
yeah, yeah.
Shroud of Turin came from a church called the Mary of La Clarne, um, or the Crown of Thorns, which is now at Notre Dame. That was in Constantinople. So vast amounts of these relics were all kept there, and those now were all brought. So
How about casualties? Death. Do we have
yeah,
any?
the actual numbers are hard to get at but it doesn't look. I mean, I've read everything there is to read on this. It doesn't look like the actual numbers of deaths in the sack were that great because everyone fled. The soldiers all fled. The among the citizens, there from the information that we have, there was lots of raping and such going on. Although there were occasions where, in fact, we know this from the Byzantine sources, where those who did those kinds of things, the Crusader, particularly the Crusade leaders, would literally like hang them if they caught them for doing it. So, but mostly it was stealing stuff. It was mostly taking things because there were mansions all over it. There were palaces all over the city. So people were just going in, throwing the owners out, and taking over the palaces. It was by far the most profitable sack in all of the Middle Ages. It was massively.
Dr. Madden, as you're explaining this, just the thing that keeps on nagging me is this is completely opposite of penitence.
Yeah.
This is like, you were better off not have gone this way. This is, I mean, from their perspective,
Yeah.
religious perspective.
Now I should say for the average Crusader, and we actually have a good source of the average Crusader. Robert of Clary he was a poor knight. He wrote his memoirs afterwards about this. So we get all the angles on this. It's unusual in a medieval thing. But from their perspective, before they attacked the city of Constantinople, their clergy, their bishops and their clergy who were on the crusade, they ruled that an attack on Constantinople was justified. And
Why?
they said it was because the emperor had gone back on his word. He had double-crossed them and refused to give them what he had promised. But also that I left out something, but that emperor, the young Alexius, he was then later strangled, and another Alexius came in, Alexius the Fifth. So and so they said, and so what they said was the Byzantines they've now overthrown their lord and taken on a new lord who killed the previous one. Now that's standard operating procedure in Constantinople, but for knights, you don't kill your lord. I mean, they think that's like the worst thing you can do is kill your lord. So
does this
they
have anything to
understood.
do with what you said earlier? You said Byzantine and Europeans had bad relations. Something changed from 1099, the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099 period, to where we are now, almost the 13th century, just shy of the 13th century. Well, this is the 13th century, 1204. What changed? Why did the relations, without getting into sort of the whole history of it, does it have to do with one being Catholic Christian, the other one being Orthodox Christian, Greek Christianity?
I mean, those problems had been around for a long time. But the differences between the two are very minor. The theological differences almost nothing. Um, there had been cultural differences prior to the Crusades that had caused frictions, but really what causes it is, frequently you'll hear people say, people from different cultures and everything, we all need to get together, we learn about each other, and then we'll all get along better. Historically speaking, that doesn't really seem to happen very often. The more they got to know each other, they were so different
Oh,
um,
wow.
that the more they hated each other. Among historians refer to anti-Latinism, which what they mean by that is in the Byzantine Empire, there was a strong hatred of Western Europeans. And they saw from their point of view, Western Europeans were stupid, barbaric, uncultured, money grubbing, with no morality, and couldn't even understand the religion that they supposedly professed. So they really didn't
Oh,
like it.
wow.
And from the Western perspective, Byzantines were wealthy, soft, um, uh, overly intellectual, weak, unable to fight their own battles or wars, and double crossing and full of intrigue. Constantly, that you can't trust anything they say. And they would completely sell out the faith, working with Muslims and not helping out the crusade.
But
So
the way you say it, it seems like at times they probably hated the Byzantines more than they hated even the Muslims. I mean,
yes, and in
wow.
fact, Nikitas Koniates, he says in his memoirs, he says that Constantinople would have been better off if the Muslims had conquered it rather than the Christians.
Oh,
So
wow. That is so
yeah,
um is in the minute or two we have left of this segment, I'm just wondering what was what happened? What's the aftermath? What do Christians of Western Europe, or I guess all of Europe for that matter, think of this? This is a calamity in Christendom.
everyone pretty much from their perspective, everyone, both Greeks and Latin, both Greeks and Westerners, they all agreed that it was God's will. They all
God's
thought,
will.
yeah, they all thought there was no way this could happen if God hadn't wanted it to happen. The Byzantines thought that it happened because of their sins, because they had sold all those things, they had ransacked the churches, and God was punishing them by doing this. The Westerners thought it was God's will.
Alexius the Fourth had done that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
right.
Okay.
And that the Westerners thought that it was God's will because God decided that the Byzantines were not helping the crusade effort, and so now it was time to give this city to somebody who would do it. In reality, what the Crusaders did was they set up a new. They elected one of their own as the new emperor. Baldwin of Flanders became Baldwin the First of Constantinople, and this kind of started a new state that historians call the Latin Empire of Constantinople, which would last until 1261. But before the Byzantines finally took back the city. But it would be enormously damaging to the city of Constantinople. When the Fourth Crusade sailed to Constantinople in 1203, the population of the city was probably around 500,000, maybe 600,000 in the metropolitan area,
Wow. Okay.
which was enormous for medieval standards. There was nothing in Western Europe like that. After the Byzantines retook the city in 1261, the population was about 15,000.
Oh, wait. From 500,000 to 15,000?
Yeah. And it would never reach that level again until the Turks took the city and made it their capital.
Then converts to Istanbul. Oh,
Right.
wow, that is fascinating. So, God's will. That's what the Europeans say. Is this in the years and decades afterwards, or does this excuse God's will? Does it also continue on for centuries? Is it a case that, like, a couple of centuries later, Europeans start thinking, you know what, we did a bad thing back then?
Many years later, in the Enlightenment, when they were making these histories of the Crusades, it tended to be viewed badly. But at the time, Western Europeans, there was a few people, some of the people who deserted the Crusade earlier, they were saying, oh, well, that wasn't God's will. But almost everybody else, including the Pope, who had excommunicated the Crusade, he had to say, well, now Constantinople is Catholic. Now the Patriarch of Constantinople is under my control. I mean, it's hard to
Not
argue
like
with
that.
success.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it looks like everything turned out. So,
Wow. Wow.
but in reality, though, this event would be something that the Greeks would not forget, and to this day, haven't forgotten it. Um, you ask your average Western European about the Fourth Crusade, they will know what you're talking about. You ask your average Greek about it, they know all about it.
And that's a good point to continue on. Let's take a break here. Stay with
Sure.
me and Dr. Madden as we get into the perspective. Dr. Madden, in the closing of the last segment, we started talking about how the Greeks have not forgotten the Fourth Crusade, that travesty that happened to their city and to their culture. Why do you think it's the case that most other people don't know about this? I learned
I mean,
about this about some 30 years ago as a much younger man. And from time to time, I bring it up, and everyone was like, what? But Constantinople was Christian. Adele, are you sure?
yeah. I think most people, I mean, I honestly, I think most people, we don't really teach history anymore. So most people don't know very much about the Crusades at all, let alone one of the Crusades that
But this is a
that
big
conquered
deal.
that conquered a city that most people couldn't find on a map anymore.
Yeah.
But as I say, in the Greek world, it's very important because it's really part of their past.
Yeah.
They see that Constantinople for them is still very much their city, even though it hasn't been since the 15th century. And the fall of Constantinople and the conquest by the Fourth Crusade, they see that as this incredible betrayal. In hindsight, they see it in that way. And well, to give you an example, in 1999, Pope John Paul II, preparing for the Jubilee year, he made a kind of a trip around doing what he called a pilgrimage. He went to the Holy Land, he went to Syria, um, and then he went to Athens. And he was, he was a rock star. Everyone loved John Paul II. No
Yeah.
matter
Yeah.
where he
Yeah.
went, there was always, even in Syria, which is a Muslim country, they came out by the tens of thousands to see him. Um, that he went to Athens, nobody came to see him.
Oh, wow.
Nobody came to the airport to greet him, except for protesters who were mostly monks, Greek monks, who were protesting. They had signs that said, "We don't need infallible pilgrims." And then he went to um, he was taken to the residence of the Archbishop, Christodoulos, Archbishop of Athens. And there, the Archbishop read a welcome address. The two of them are sitting in chairs. He read a welcome address to the Pope. And it wasn't much of a welcome. It was all about the Fourth Crusade,
Oh,
the
wow.
conquest of Constantinople, and then the period of Latin occupation of Greece.
This
And
is
about,
happening in 1999.
yeah, I remember the London Times did an editorial. It's like, what is he talking about? Get over it. To give you one more example, if you remember a number of years ago, Greece was in bad shape financially, and they were needing EU bailouts.
Oh, yeah. It can't
And
happen after our own great recession after
That's right.
2008. Yeah.
That's right. Well, there were several op-eds that were written of Greeks who were saying that Europe should be glad to give them the money because if you consider everything that the Europeans stole from Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade plus interest, you're getting off easy.
Oh my gosh. That's not history. That's alive for them.
Oh yeah, it's very much. There are two big for the Greeks. There's two really big things. 1204 is important. Now, 1453 is more so because that was when the Turks conquered
Yeah.
Constantinople. But 1204 is still a very big deal for them. As an expert on the Fourth Crusade myself, I have frequently given lectures in different places, and I can always tell if there's someone who was raised in a Greek environment because they will always have some choice words for me
Oh boy.
about the Fourth
Do they
Crusade.
disagree with you or did
They tend to view it as a there's no nuance. Let's put it that way.
yeah, yeah.
There's
It's
no real
black and
nuance.
white.
It's a clear black and white issue in which the Catholics came and they did this horrible thing to them and to their city.
For them,
And
you're probably not critical enough of the Catholics, right?
I just my interest in this is the fascinating, and I could talk for hundreds of hours about it, but the fascinating interplay of many different people. I'm very much in what's known as the accident school, which means that this is an event that nobody actually meant to happen. It was just a lot of people put into bad situations, trying to do the best they could in those bad situations. This crusade, they kept trying to keep it together. They kept kind of doing whatever they could to keep it together. And then ultimately they ended up being sucked into the Byzantine politics and power structures, and then were eaten alive by them.
When you say they were trying to keep it together, when I asked you about the Fourth Crusade, you started with Venice, and you started with how the French were organizing their military expedition. 33,500 soldiers were planned. I was wondering in the back of my mind, why are you going so far back? Let's get to Constantinople. But now that you go back and say, keep it together, it really sets the stage how by the time they got to uh, Constantinople, it was just a series of things that happened. They were really just trying to survive here.
Yeah, and that's
It's not
why.
an excuse. I'm just saying it was not, there was not a grand plan to go to Constantinople at all.
No, no. Actually, the Venetians did not want to go to Constantinople. They had a large uh, quarter there, about 11,000 Venetians who lived there permanently
Oh,
in
wow.
Constantinople. The Venetian quarter was there. They had a very profitable relationship with Constantinople. It was not in their interest at all to go.
Yeah,
They would have been much more happy to gone to Egypt, where they had no footprint.
exactly.
The Genoese did all kinds of business there, and the Genoese were their main rivals. So they would
Yeah.
have loved to have gone to Egypt.
Why
But
ruin a good business relationship? Are there any lessons here for us Americans from the Fourth Crusade and its aftermath, its history?
I think not really for Americans. No, it's I think it's definitely very useful to understand it as far as the situations that still motivate uh, um, a lot of the disputes we see, but in particularly between Greeks and Turks today. Um, in fact, just very recently, I think it was last year, uh, when Erdogan, the president of Turkey, uh, turned Hagia Sophia back into a mosque. Hagia Sophia was the Byzantines' great church. That was the
Yeah.
church built by Justinian. He restored it now as a mosque, and the Greeks were extremely upset about this. But also the Pope Francis, also said that he was very sorry to see
I
this
think
happen.
much of the world was upset. It was a museum. Yeah.
It was a museum, right?
Yeah.
I was upset. Trust me,
Yeah.
I go there regularly, and it's
Oh,
greatly
that
upset.
must be great. You know
But
what? Oh, go ahead, please.
but I was just going to say, Erdogan, his response to the Pope was, "Well, your crusade did far more damage to this church
Oh,
than
come
I'm doing."
on. Now, the
So,
Ordowan is referring to for the
yeah.
Fourth Crusade. That is fascinating. You know, I asked you if there are any lessons. I think I can draw one lesson.
Okay.
Maybe you share it or not. It- we talked about how the Crusades happened. I mean, generally in broad strokes, and then the Fourth Crusade. One lesson is that now that the U.S. has been in the Middle East for decades, militarily speaking, since President Carter's doctrine, and before that, in many different facets. One thing is that we don't really understand how they view history, whether they're Greeks that still talk about the fourth century, I'm sorry, the Fourth Crusade, or whether it's the Middle Eastern Muslims who, until the late 19th century, didn't really know much about the Crusades. It was a blip on everything else that was going on. Maybe that's one lesson for us to know that
It is. It's a
they
good
really,
lesson to have. Yeah.
yeah, they look at things.
Lesson to know.
If you wanted our audience to remember just one point about the Fourth Crusade after everything we talked about, what would that be? Just one point.
Uh, about the Fourth Crusade, I
Yeah.
would say it was a it was I actually I think I'd use what my mentor used to say. It was like a man shooting the rapids. Um,
A man
they
shooting the rapids?
shooting the rapids. That most of the decisions are not his, but the decisions that he does make are crucial.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And that's essentially what happened in the Fourth Crusade. They were being pulled along on this thing. Some of the decisions they made were crucial. Some of them were forced on them. Ultimately, they were all surprised by everyone was surprised by what happened, and that's what
Wow.
makes it such a fascinating story. It's definitely one of unintended outcomes and consequences. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating as you told it in our conversation. Dr. Madden, thank you for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could unravel the Middle East, please share it with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.